Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Today is our 100th episode. In reviewing the history of the show, it's paradoxical how much we've covered, yet how little. How long we've been doing it, yet how short it's been. How many places we've gone without going anywhere at all. We've brought you episodes about the biggest subjects imaginable, broken down into bite-sized pop cultural pieces. And we've taken mundane, single-word topics and fleshed them out in all their intricate, multidisciplinary glory. We've looked at titanic philosophers from the past and present. We've read tales about diverse characters from around the world. We've done videos dissecting clips from relevant television and film. And we've interviewed interesting people from many walks of life. And we're not done. We never could be because it's not in our nature, even though someday the show will inevitably end. You'll be hearing fresh thoughts from new voices in the coming weeks, but for today, we'll ask you to excuse us as we rest on our laurels just a bit and indulge in some nostalgic reflection. However, make no mistake, we're not just reminiscing about the good times in this podcast. Yes, even today's show has a theme. But what one-word theme could possibly encompass everything I just covered? I'm glad you asked. Today, we'll be talking about metaphilosophy.
That was delightful. Nah, we don't rest on laurels. No, we don't. Neither one of us thought we were going to get to it yet. I was about to say issue 100 because I'm a big comic book person.
Yeah.
But what fun! And no, we're not done.
Yeah, no, it's been fantastic, and it wouldn't happen without you.
It certainly wouldn't happen without you, man. I mean, you're engineering, and you're the one who reached out in the first place. So
yeah, and I reached out, and I thought that we'd just do 10 episodes on the biggest topics, and we did those 10, and I said, what do you think about making this a regular thing, doing a podcast? And he said yes, and then my immediate next thought was, we're going to run out of topics. There's, we already did 10 episodes about the biggest things there are. What else is there to talk about?
Yep.
And, again, talking about the paradoxes of philosophy, right? We've talked about many different things, but many of the same strands from those first 10 episodes run through them, right? We cover, inevitably we start digging into whatever it may be, all the way from time and God to tools or social media. And there's threads that run between all of them,
language threads, cultural threads, or moments of universality that we may not have expected. And those are fun to stumble upon or to think about and say, well, I was thinking about this, and then stun ourselves with where it takes us that we didn't expect. That's, for me, this has always been partly not a show in the sense of showing somebody else how something is done in a formal way. Oh, look at us! But it has been an authentic conversation, which is where philosophy resides, and it's where learning resides. Is laced with good humor and a mind that says, "I don't know everything. I know very little."
Yeah,
and that just lets you keep going.
That's exactly right, because the listeners, you've gotten to know me over the past 99 episodes, but you probably don't understand to what level I'm kind of a hermit or a DIY reclusive person. So, we talk about my music, right? I play all the instruments. I do all the recording. I do all the engineering. I am writing a book, and doing everything from beginning to end. I just do, that's the way I do things. And when I thought about doing the podcast, I thought about just doing it myself, right? Just, okay, I just want to cover 10 topics and I'll put them out there and see what happens. And I started listening to other philosophy podcasts to see how they were doing it. And I stumbled across 2 or 3 of them out there where there were guys doing that same thing. And I thought, this is bad. This is not good. There's something about philosophy, like you said. If you're just if philosophy is a monologue, it's not philosophy, it's history, right? It's history, or it's education, it's something. But philosophy happens in the dialogue, right? You look at Socrates, right? You look at Plato, you look at these interactions between other people having dialogues, Hume and Kant, right? These people with their back and forth about what is,
what is, and fill in the blank.
Yeah, anything, right?
Or
anything
how does, and fill in the blank. Or what if, and fill in the blank. And that dialogue, dialoguing, some people, well, there are always people who will look at such things and say, well, you're just shooting the crap. Well, you're just wasting air, or something like that. But anybody who feels that way misses the point of the dialogue, even if the dialogue has missed the point for them, which is probing and building and self-correcting and revising in order to try to get to a truth. Because philosophy primarily is not about a given or foregone truth. There have been some philosophers who've argued it from those positions, of course, but for me, because of my teachers, because of my reading, and because of our ongoing dialogue and so many others, it's a matter of exploration. It's like doing art. My daughter-in-law had this wonderful moment yesterday. She said, let's have a clay day. And she's an art teacher, and she has a little pottery studio that she's been establishing. And she's been teaching my granddaughter, who I often mention. And so here were 3 generations of us working on pottery on a lovely sunny day yesterday. And with any art that I do, I always find that I'm constantly trying to, in this case, I was making a luminarium, and I just saw where my fingernail had been on something, and I wet my finger. And because this is my first real experience with clay, but it makes you just want to keep touching the clay and knowing that, I did this, but now this is sloping over here a little bit, and I work on this and something else, because it's never going to be perfect.
Right.
It's going to be yours. And when it's at a point where you say, yeah, I put my initials on that. Well, I think that's what we do every week. It's, an artist doesn't automatically sign everything that he, she, or they do. It's when, and my art teachers led me to this too. When you say, nope, now it's ready for my imprimatur. Now it's ready for those initials or whatever sign we make. Because I'm saying, yeah, this is good enough for the moment.
Yeah. And I think you're right. We do that every week, and that's the thing, is it's sort of a Russian nesting doll of that, right? Because, there's been a lot of times where, we're in the course of a discussion, and for whatever reason, maybe it's moving too fast for my thoughts to catch up or whatever. I'll listen back to the episode the next week and I'll think, yeah, that was an illogical or an irrational thing to say. And I've admitted it on the show lots of times. I'll come in the next week and I'll say, listen, guys, I don't know what I was thinking last week, but I said this thing. I've had some time to think about it, and I'm going back, right? The important thing, I think, about philosophy, and we've said this about the show, right? You just mentioned it, is we're not sitting here preaching philosophy. This is not a monologue with the listeners. This is a discussion with the listeners, right? Yeah. It's not just a discussion between you and I. It's a discussion with everybody who's listening. We want to engage you in the process of philosophy. So when we sit here and we have the discussion, sometimes we come across epiphanies that I'm proud of, that I think, you know what, if we didn't do this podcast, I don't know that I ever would have arrived at this thought on my own.
Precisely.
But then there's other times where I put my foot straight in my mouth, right? But that's not a bad thing.
No.
We're indoctrinated with thinking that failure or these irrational thoughts are bad. No, they're learning experiences, right? Going back, reflecting on it, remolding the clay, right? So every week we put out a clay figure, and it's never perfect. But then the next week, inevitably, like we've said, these strains that run through the episodes, these, metaphysical, epistemological, ontological themes that continue to pop up, it gives us the opportunities to remold the clay a little bit differently, right? And it's always been a fascinating experience, and it's always ongoing, right? And I hope that the goal from the beginning was to bring philosophy, which in modern times has been largely ignored
and specialized, gone so specialized.
Yeah, bringing it to the public again in a way that encourages lay people to think about big topics, because whether or not you think about them, people have opinions, right? People subscribe to a religion, or they, wholeheartedly believe in science despite not having the technical knowledge to understand it, or whatever the case may be, right? Everybody has these beliefs. And philosophy is just merely the process of looking at them a little bit closer and trying to figure out why you believe them.
Yeah, looking at the provenance, the source of the beliefs, the inconsistency of the beliefs. We're human beings. We are always going to be inconsistent in something. We can. One of the things I've much enjoyed over many decades of the Doctor Who character, the British science fiction character, a Time Lord, is that he will excoriate human beings. He will say, you think you evolved and you didn't. You're still back in the caves. And then he'll say, but sometimes you're so brilliant. He gets upset about that because sometimes you're so brilliant. How come you can't hang on to that? And that's what he loves human beings for, is those moments when they can be brilliant. So I just want to please Doctor Who once in a while, but it's, and we, in our time on a planetary level, there are big issues. Now we're talking about big issues today, but the sad thing is when people will use social media as a place to make absolute pronouncements. And then if anyone attempts to shape that clay, then the pronouncements are doubled down upon because of the absolute surety that that is the truth and there's no way around it. And if you say anything else, then you're lying. Or if you say anything, it just gets into grenades being tossed at each other. Right.
Yeah.
That's not a discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you mentioned something earlier in the episode that caught my interest, right? Which is thinking about philosophy as discovering truths, right? That's sort of an ancient Western way of looking at things, right? It's a Platonic or an Aristotelian.
I just stepped right on it.
Yeah. It's a Platonic or an Aristotelian way of thinking of things. But then you immediately recorrected and said it's an exploration, right? Yeah. And that is the point, right? Is that the truth coming coming to these, knowable truths or these ultimate truths or these sorts of things. It's an idealistic thing that is very appealing. And it's something that I think there's a human need for, right? I think that most people want that. They want that ultimate truth that they can pronounce and hold on to and know. Yeah. And philosophy, although some philosophy, it claims to be looking for that. But really what it does is the exact opposite, right? It's this exploration that constantly takes you to places that makes that truth more and more unknowable, right? It
is why, for me as a literature reader, and by literature I include everything, basically. I'm not going to be a cultural snob about this. I will read a Thor comic book with great relish, a heavy metal magazine, fantasy and science fiction magazine, Shakespeare, Cicero, Kant, and Homer, and care philosophers, Carol Gilligan, and it's not about what you've read as goalposts, as end. It's not an ending point. So the best literature that we have I have found in translation around sampling around the world are the stories that are about exploration. Odysseus is never satisfied, not even when he gets back home, not even when he brutally kills all of the people who were trying to take over his household and his wife and all that patriarchal stuff. Ultimately, he stays home for a little while, and then he has to go back out on the journey again. And Yeats has one of the most lovely poems that expresses this. All experience is an arch where through, I'm paraphrasing, gleams the world forever and forever. So you come to an arch. What do? If you come to an arch, what are you likely to do, Joel?
Probably walk under it.
Yeah, me too. Why did the chicken cross the road? Okay, so why did the philosopher walk through the arch? To see what's on the other side, or rather to see what's next.
Right.
Or to see how what looks behind looks like through the arch. There's one of the most famous American poems that is so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow in the rain, and so on and so on. But it's about there's another poem about a bottle, and the very fact of seeing that shape in a landscape entirely changes the landscape, draws your attention. Therefore, how you see the landscape changes, and that's what philosophy is. The landscape is going to keep changing.
Yeah. And these are, again, one thing that we talk about is these universal things that run through human experience. And just hearing you talk about that, it reminds me of, there's several ways that can happen. It can happen through literature. I remember in the first class I took with you, you had us read some poems in Ozymandias, right?
Oh, yes.
Talk about changing the landscape, right? This monolithic thing. Or on my way to work this week, seeing an owl on the telephone pole, right? You get so used to seeing crows, or red-tailed hawks, and even now bald eagles. I've got 3 adolescent bald eagles on my way to work that, you see them, and it's always interesting to look for them, but then you see an owl and you go, oh my gosh, this is something that's changing the way that I look at the world,
Yes.
And yeah, it is. It's a fundamental part of human experience.
And it is a childlike thing that one nurtures into adulthood. I was blown away by things that I've been blown away by things. And this sounds like Grandpa braggadocio, but it isn't. It's just about noticing what children do. What's that doing there? My granddaughter will ask. What do you see? And she has seen a little daddy long-legged spider walking in a spot that I didn't even notice the spider at all. Or a couple of days ago, we were sitting on the grass under a shade tree waiting for her mom and dad to go get some ice cream. And she looked at the ground and she said, Grandpa, what's wrong with that worm? And I looked where she was looking and I saw 2 sticks in this thicket of grass. And I said, oh, I think those sticks resemble worms. And I picked the stick up and she said, no, the worm right behind the stick. And I looked and there was a worm that was partially raising a segment up in the air, moving just a little bit. And I thought to myself, how did she notice that? Well, she's a child who's noticing everything. We think they turn off when we somehow cast our minds to another task. They don't. They're right there. It's working. But that is a metaphor for all of us. Our minds are always right there working and can be attentive if we want them to be.
Yeah, I think that the metaphor you used one time with me was that you're always trying to strip the bark off, in order to continue growing. And really, I mean, in a physiological sense, that is what we're doing. As you grow into an adult, you have these neurons that get myelinated, right? So in order to improve their speed and their efficiency. But part of what it does is that it makes it harder to think outside of that neural pathway. Your electricity is just funneled down the same path all the time, right?
Yeah.
And it's something that you have to nurture, but it can be done. I don't think that it's something that fades with because it's funny that you should mention that, because I was researching this last night, right? Thinking about worms and thinking about, wow, you have a worm and one half of it's male and one half of it's female. And then that led me down this whole rabbit hole of cannibalism in animals and the reasons for it, and all of these different things where, all right, well, maybe those specific thoughts wouldn't occur to a child, but the mindset, the mind frame, rather than just looking at this and saying, okay, well, this is how things are. The question is, why is that how they are? Or what is it like for it to be
what
that
is it
way?
like? And that is one of the biggest meta questions there is across philosophy is, what is it, or what is it like? And by saying what is it like, we're trying to do a comparative analysis. And when you just said that, my mind just went pop. Okay, right. So we're okay with worms being male and female, and we don't question that or the nature of God's creation, but
yeah.
You know where I'm going with that ellipsis. And if we don't listen to what each other's, I mean, you just, for me, even though you referenced something that I once said to you, you just handed the gift back and gave me a whole, I'm not any longer going to think about thinking outside of the box. I'm going to think about thinking through the myelination because it works much better. I can just picture sap and the stickiness and trying to, no, don't let me be locked into these lines.
Yeah. So my first question, 21 and a half minutes into the show, was, what is metaphilosophy? And I think that we've covered that in a lot of ways, but is there anything that you would add as we start to look at this?
Yeah, I would. There are at least 4 categories of philosophy we can put the word meta on, which really means we should probably examine the word meta. But metaphilosophy is meta ethics and meta epistemology. Meta is, in that sense, referring to looking at the structure of the structure. It's stepping back away. It is taking I hesitate to say God's eye view. I won't do that. It's as if you can step back out of the Milky Way galaxy and look at it from a distance and see how it's structured, which we do astronomically. Look at other galaxy structures. When we're at the periphery of we're out in the countryside of our own galaxy. We're nowhere near the cosmopolitan center, and we're caught up in our daily lives looking at the heads of worms coming up out of the ground. That's not the same as looking at the whole galaxy. And so meta is taking this view that's, how does it seem to function, and why do we structure it as we do? Right.
So there's probably a lot of listeners now thinking like, okay, well, I thought that's what philosophy was, right? Philosophy is looking at these things in depth. So metaphilosophy is looking at how we philosophize.
The philosophy of philosophy, yes.
So what is there to be gained by philosophizing about philosophy?
Many things. One of them, as you've referred to it today, is to course correct, to say, wait a minute. I'm going to use another figuration here because I own an old house. And anyone who's owned a house or lives in an apartment that other people have lived in for generations, and so sooner or later, you're going to open up the wall and you're going to find something about the electronics or the plumbing, and you're going to almost inevitably say, why did they do that? I've heard myself do that countless times. I've heard contractors do that.
Yeah.
And so that's the process of metaphilosophy, is to open up the walls and say, why would you wire it this way? We now know better ways to wire things. Maybe that was the way when all you had was this material for the wiring, or that concept of what wiring was. But now we know more about electricity. We can make this better, knowing full well that 100 years from now, if the structure is still extant, somebody's going to open that wall again and say, what?
Yeah. I think what happens with metaphilosophy, I think that metaphilosophy has been happening for a long time, because like we said, you look back at Plato, right? And you see this idealism that, okay, things exist out there, right? What do you think hume Kant and these guys, 1,500 years later, what do you think that they were arguing about? These things within themselves and these sorts of stuff. It's not the same idea, right? They're not arguing about the same thing, but they are taking what's been philosophized about, and then they're reapplying with the knowledge that's been gained throughout history, how we think about some of these things, and putting them in a new, fresh sense. And by doing that, making it philosophy, right?
Yes.
Do you think that all philosophy stems from metaphilosophy?
Well, in the sense that that's a really interesting question. If we look at the etymology of meta, and we sidestep for a moment the standard, it's called New Latin phrasing, which is essentially the scientific application of Latin words to categorizing things. Before that, meta, and maybe it's now again coming to be this, it means among, with, after. Now, just those three words, if a meta means that I'm among, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm part of. With means I'm part of. After means I've moved on. And that's what the process of meta in philosophy, I think, is I'm among, let's say I'm among these ideas. My thoughts are among these. They're these strangers, and or so. But then I start having a dialogue, and I'm with. But then maybe that dialogue ends. People go their own directions, and then time passes, and then something is after, and I might not even be part of what's after. So it's looking at that bigger picture. I mean, we look at, no matter what our orientations are, and no matter how much we tell ourselves we're going to live forever, and maybe in a spiritual sense, for some, that's a truth. Still, we have moments when we feel invulnerable. Still, we have moments when we feel, well, no, not today. Don't know that, but we, but we're vital and we're alive, and we may be sick, we may be well, we may be wounded, we may be scarred, but we're still there. And so is philosophy. And so we can look at a galaxy and say, we can talk about the billions of years of a galaxy without really knowing what a billion years is, except for a nice construct. Oh, it's a long time. You bet. And we watch starships on TV shows flying, and it still takes for us at best 3 days to get to the moon, if we can ever get a ship launched. and so meta is saying, look at the construct you have made. What are its limitations? Where might it be stronger or more flexible? What pieces need to be thrown out? And then that takes me right back to the ship of Theseus.
Yeah.
If you have rot on your house, and you have A, the time, B, the means to fix it, and C, the know-how to fix it, then you're probably going to patch it or fix it or remove it or have somebody else come and do it. Maybe you don't have the means or the time. Well, the house is not going to fall because of that little bit of rot, but you know that more is going to happen. But if you identify rot and you said, it's okay, it doesn't matter because that can't happen to the rest of my house, then you're going to be in trouble sooner or later.
Yeah. Yeah, man. All right. Yeah, we're off to a good start. So, what initially got you interested in philosophy?
Oh, man. It was sort of a slingshot. I think I was always interested in philosophy, just didn't understand it. I talked ideas with friends, but it also had a very, in some ways, restrictive sub-theme going on in my life with religion when I was a kid. and had an epiphanic moment at college when I realized that's not really what religion must necessarily be about. I'm going to study religions as a minor. Well, studying religions as a minor quickly became studying philosophy as a minor, because philosophy came up in every literature class, it came up in history class. And so it became readily apparent, even to a lunkhead like me, that there was an overarching, a superstructure.
Right.
And it was philosophy. And when I found the professor who said that very thing and welcomed me into the conversation, then it was for life. It was for life in the sense that I realized that even though in graduate school I didn't formally study philosophy as a major, I would still take a class here and there with philosophy. So you could say, well, I was accruing the credits. Well, it was about continuing to realize that it permeated or foundationalized everything else. And so even as I was teaching literature or composition, writing, there is entirely there. It's called pedagogy in education terms. Pedagogy is philosophy. What is the philosophy and theory of your practice? Well, if I'm going to ask what the theory of my practice is, I've got to philosophize about that. To philosophize about that is to go back to whether Eastern, Western, or both. Well, how have other people done education? Why has this worked? Why hasn't this worked? What are the debates? And so that was why, because it was always underlying my specializations. It was coming to realize, Joel, over decades, that it's always been there.
Yeah, I've discovered the same thing on my own educational journey, is that, it doesn't, every major that you start, right? I would bet in almost 100% of them, your first intro class, the word philosophy is going to be mentioned, because it is that, like you said, it's the meta narrative of all other knowledge, right? I think for me, it started with Crime and Punishment, actually. I was like 14 and I just saw the book sitting on my dad's bookshelf, and the title just kind of grabbed me. I thought, oh, Crime and Punishment. Huh. And then I read the book, and it's just this gripping psychological story where not much actually happens in the real world, but all of this happens within this guy's head, right? Which opened me up to everything else Dostoevsky. And, after reading that, all of that, I started, you start having these conversations. And it's funny because, like you said, this idea of what philosophy is, our perspective on philosophy has changed so much over time.
Yes.
If you were to ask me what philosophy was when I was 14 and read Dostoevsky, I'd say, I don't know. My mom, I took a logic course when I was in school, so I knew about the Greek philosophers. That was pretty much it. I probably said, Plato, Aristotle, and I guess, but there wasn't much there. But after reading Crime and Punishment, all of a sudden you find the course and the nature of your conversations with other people changing, right? It goes from, especially as a 14-year-old boy, like, talking about video games or, talking about school or whatever you talk about, to all of a sudden asking your friend, hey man, like, do you think you could actually kill somebody? Like, do you think that, what do you think what would happen to you if this had, hey, well, where'd all this stuff come from, right? Mm-hmm. And then, I distinctly remember a coworker of mine at McDonald's, right? We're 17 years old, working the second shift, closing up the restaurant at 11, and then hanging out till 3:30 in the morning in the dining room, right? Talking about philosophy. But I didn't know it was philosophy, right? I didn't know what it was.
You were doing it.
Yeah.
You weren't talking about it.
Right. And
you
then
were engaged in it.
Yeah. And so then my older brother had taken a couple classes with you, and he knew I was going to college, and he said, hey, listen, you really have to take some classes with Norm Gayford. And I said, okay, what does he teach? Well, he teaches English, and I don't even think you were teaching philosophy at that time yet.
No, I wasn't.
He said, he teaches English. I said, oh, okay. I'm not really interested in it, but whatever, okay. And, you have to take an English course, in school. And of course, this brings up that whole debate. Well, should people have to take humanities courses? Yes, you should, because it will change your life in some cases, right? I was going for a degree in criminal justice, mostly because I was a child and just didn't know what I wanted to do when I grow up, and I still don't. But I thought, well, okay, criminal justice, you might get to do something cool. All right, introductory writing course. I'll take this Norm Gayford that my brother mentioned, and that's where I learned what philosophy was. Right? I think that I remember looking at the book list and thinking, these aren't textbooks. These are just regular books, and then reading through them, and then the assignments. You didn't ask us to write papers, to regurgitate what happened in the story, or to analyze. It was already at that point about synthesis, about, okay, well, take what's being said and then apply it to what you already know, and then come up with a unique perspective, what this means to you.
Yeah.
And beyond that, in the college setting, in a physical classroom, right, you're going to be expected to defend those beliefs, not necessarily from antagonistic people, but from people who are going to ask you questions, and they're going to want a rational, logical response to them. And then I think you started teaching philosophy the next semester, and I was like, I've got to get in on this class. So I got in and you gave me Simon Blackburn, and a bunch of other Rollo May, some of these other guys. And from that point on, I was hooked, right? That was it. But it just goes to demonstrate, right? I don't think that you or I are these exceptions to the rule of how people think. I think that everybody has these experiences. Maybe some of them aren't nurtured as much, but people think about this stuff. Everybody thinks about this stuff to some regard.
They do. You're right, and I just that touches my heart deeply. That story and your dear brother, who also always highly regarded as your whole family. I just. Yeah, it's not about being an exception. But it is about constantly reminding oneself. We are in such a combative age that it takes such fortitude, will, really, to remind oneself that what you just said, which is so that every human being has this capacity, and most people engage in it without realizing it, but often don't have the place to engage. And I've been really fortunate. This, we're celebrating the 100th. I'm going to say it. I am forever grateful for this opportunity, because when you reached out, and who knew we were going to be talking about metaphilosophy, but when it was a chance to teach in a different way, informally. I'm no fundamentally different with you in this podcast with us together than I think than I was in a classroom, except that there was a syllabus, right?
Right.
And the bell rings or whatever the equivalent is. But the joy of interacting with minds, of whatever age, and wanting ultimately to make a space, or to be part of a space in which people can explore things without feeling like they're going to walk on landmines, which is really, this is, I think, the meta philosophy of looking at composition and writing as an example. So many people approach writing as do's and don'ts. Still, despite composition theory, despite decades of study of all of this, and I say decades, that's not very long in this experience of human writing. We're theorizing about it now. Yay for us. But to make a place where you don't feel like you have to. You're playing this twisted game of Twister, where right foot red. Okay, go over there. Nope, don't touch red. I mean blue. Well, because you used the comma the wrong way, so you're a failed writer, because it's all about that comma. No, but what is the comma for?
Right.
There's a place for that discussion, but it's not at the beginning of the discussion. And if people have a place where they feel like they can explore something without somebody jumping on them, and usually that is through the dialectic method.
Absolutely. And I know personally at least 3 other people that took your writing courses and went on to write books. Maybe they didn't publish them, but I know people who have written books because they had the same experience that I had, right? They went to the class and they engaged with the thinking about this sort of stuff, and they thought to themselves, I can do this. And they created things, right? And that's really the fascinating part about it. And that's what I wanted to recreate with the show, was those discussions that we had in the classroom, right?
Yeah.
Those, especially even the ones that happened after class, right? I remember I'd always be keeping you after class. We'd do our hour, and then I'd stay after and I'd ask you questions until you had to run to the next class. I'd keep you there every last second.
Yeah.
And that's what we try to do here, right? Is just say things that get people at home to think about it and to engage with it. So do you think you know more now than when you started, or have your views just changed?
You remember when we talked a number of episodes back about finding out more and then realizing, nothing, or or finding out that what you knew was wrong, but that's been the lifelong process. I get humbled more times than I can count every single day with what I don't know, or negotiating the world of insurance policies, or trying to figure out how something works, and managing to fix it or not. Throw up my hand. The practical. I think that I have learned more, because we do learn things, but the more one learns, the more one reads, the more one is in contact with people, the more one realizes the universe is expanding. We know that physically, we know that through metaphysics, but our internal universe is expanding too. So it would be as much to say as, okay, I'm going to get a map of Warsaw. Well, it's really interesting when I walk around Warsaw, and I walk a lot. Do I remember the name of every street in Warsaw? No. In this little place in Western New York. And then I look around and I realize about 99.9% of the places in this just little bit of terrain, I will never walk in. I will never know behind the door what's there. I've been up this road, but there's some streets I've never been on. And if there are driveways that I haven't driven up. And that's just in a little place. Right. Well, let's unfold the map. Now we're into Wyoming County. Now we're into New York State. Now we're in the United States, and so on and so on and so on. So no, I don't know.
Yeah. I had an interesting exchange with my wife the other day. She asked me something. Hey, what about this? And I said, I don't know. She said, well, what do you mean you don't know? And I was like, I don't know. She's like, well, you know everything. If I ask you a question, you know the answer. And I said, well, not really. Like, if you ask me a question, I'm going to find the answer.
Or attempt to.
Yeah. So she'll ask me things, and then I'll go and I'll look up the answer and give it to her. That's really what it is, right? Mm-hmm. It's not this idea, even if I do know something, right? Hey, what about this? Lots of times I'm already thinking in my head, well, has this changed since the last time I engaged with it, right? That's the responsible thing to do, right? And you mentioned this before the episode when we were talking about an individual who had a degree, got a degree 30 years ago, and still wants to act like an authoritative expert on it, right? That's not
without keeping up.
That's a false way of that society thinks of how a degree works. Once you have the degree, you have the piece of paper, you can get a job, you're an expert in it, and you don't have to deal with school anymore, right?
Right. That's
not really it, right? Like you have to continue to learn about things, and especially once you get to the level that you or I are at in academia, it's not enough to say, oh, well, I have a PhD in psychology. 30 years from now, I'm going to, just continue regurgitating what I learned in this class.
Right. I don't need to learn anymore.
Drastically.
Right. If the people who would, and this is often the people it makes me sad because we all plant flags. We all create borders and lines we won't cross and whatever, that kind of stuff. But I think when people present their resumes as the be all end all before conversation begins, it's not healthy. It's as much as to say, well, here's what I know, so don't trot into this ground. Or, I think that runs counter to the idea of meta, because if you don't consider what you don't know, and you don't consider about the limitations of the structures within which you have been trained, then you're unlikely to push beyond that. And you look. I've been just fortunate in opportunities. It seems that I will have an opportunity very, very soon to, as a volunteer, to talk with a group of graduate students about how to negotiate their writing of a thesis and adhering to APA format. Because of some situations in which they haven't been invited to have those discussions by the very professors who are teaching them. So I'm sort of volunteering to be in a subversive position in which I will be upfront with these students saying, I'm a generalist, really, in a sense, and I'm not a formal classroom teacher anymore, but I'm willing to help you out with APA, and I'm willing to read your work and listen to what you have to say and to have the conversation. So it may be that unofficially, off the books, subversively, I get to work with 13 more individuals from all places, online in Zoom or something. And I'm excited about that because it's one more chance to say it doesn't have to be stodgy. The structure has more malleability than people sometimes tell you.
Yeah.
That's what concerns me about the metaverse, really. But we can get to that later.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you and I talk about it a lot. Like, this idea of pushing credentials or, really, I mean, people know on the show, we kind of rail against categorization in the sense of
an absolutist.
Yeah. And, I'd like to think that gets lived out in my everyday life pretty well. I don't go around advertising to people that I'm working on a PhD or that I'm doing these different things, right? But you don't have to. If you start having discussions with people and then you start contributing what you know or what your thoughts are on a matter, people will take that for what it is if it's something that's been well thought out, right? The 17-year-old kid I was having a discussion with in McDonald's, to me, is just as much a philosopher as some of the people that I've engaged with in school who have master's degrees in philosophy, because you can have a school, all right, well, you can break it down to categories again, right? Oh, well, it only has national accreditation or regional accreditation, right. Or who are your professors? What classes did you choose? Did you actually think about your topics, or were you just a very good writer? Were you a very good test taker? The credentials don't mean as much in that regard.
They don't. They do mean something.
Yes.
A dear person in my life is working on a medical degree. I want a doctor who has learned a lot, right? I think our specializations, of course, mean that we've learned some things, but they don't mean that we're done learning. They mean that we can offer some observations, sometimes canted by the specialty, or specialties plural, but it doesn't mean it's the last word. It's just the beginning word.
Yeah.
Well, even at the beginning of the podcast, you've always mentioned something about yourself and my once and future title. But it's not like, it's professor of English and philosophy, and therefore is telling you he knows everything about this. Of course not. It's just there's a starting point in the discussion. A doctoral student and it starts the discussion. Oh, well, why would you do that? What's interesting about that? That's not planting a barrier post with a gate. It's saying, hey, this is something about me. Let's talk more about you.
Yeah. So, speaking of beginning words, what's your favorite metaphysical topic?
Favorite metaphysical? Yeah. Oh, well, okay. I will do a blended answer. Time and the multiverse.
Yeah, that's the one I had, was space time.
Yeah,
right?
Okay, space time.
Because it's a fascinating topic because of relativity, right? I mean, I think that when you think about the fact that, for all intents and purposes, the theories that we currently have that have been reaffirmed through much experimental observation,
up to and including the Webb telescope,
seem to indicate that space and time operate as one thing, which is sort of weird, right? That means that this room that we're sitting in is actually, we're actually sitting in a time, right? We're our bodies take up time, right? Space.
Yes.
It's a very strange concept. And then, I mean, time by itself is fascinating, right? This idea that we can have different perceptions of time, right? If we don't have a clock, you can put us in different scenarios in a room by ourselves with nothing to do, or in a busy context, and we'll perceive time differently. Or you can put a clock up in a spaceship and fly it around the Earth, and time will have passed differently. And that says, okay, well, what are the implications for space then, right? If you move somebody faster, they age slower, right? All these things. And I think, to me, the most fascinating theory on this is Roger Penrose, who, talking about the beginnings of the universe, which is a favorite of mine. And the James Webb Space Telescope is turning everything on its head again, right? Yeah. We're finding out, okay, well, we thought if you look back to the beginning of time, you're going to see stars just being formed and galaxies really just these small chaotic messes. And Hubble seemed to tell us that was the case. But now we're finding out, no, Hubble just didn't have the capabilities. It was only seeing the youngest, brightest stars. But Webb is able to see the older, colder stars. And they're finding that these fuzzy, chaotic, tiny bits are actually well-formed, orderly galaxies at the beginning of time. And we go, what does that mean, right? And we have to rethink everything. Yep. And so, and Roger Penrose is one of those guys that rethought everything, looking at it, right? And thinking about, okay, well, if the Big Bang, for all intents and purposes, it has a lot of the same physics as a black hole. It's pretty simple, right? And then on top of that, if we extrapolate out modern physics and we see that, okay, well, at some point in the future, everything will be diffuse. It will be so far apart that things can no longer gravitationally hold together. Matter decays into energy. It's just this diffuse energy state. Well, wait a minute. Those physics are the same as the Big Bang physics. So what if this Big Bang that happened, and then everything spreads out and becomes diffuse, and then you basically zoom out far enough until this huge diffuse universe is a small, dense point in space, and it starts again, right? Yes. A mind-blowing concept. It's almost metaphilosophical in its own sort of Zen way.
Yeah. I just a pop cultural image just popped into my head. Pop, like the frothy quantum bubbles. It's from Men in Black. When you just keep pulling back and pulling back and pulling back, that's the meta view. Yeah. And when you pull back, you can be stunned and frightened and horrified and awestruck and land in a sublime realm. We've talked about that. And realize at the same time, I can't possibly get my head around this, even though my words sound like I'm wrestling to get my head around this.
I got to ask you, have you seen the digital artwork where people do that? I'm going to have Amanda pull up one of these for you after the show. Artists are doing this artwork where they'll draw a picture and then digitally they'll zoom in, right? So they'll draw a picture of a girl. You'll zoom in on the pupil of her eye, and then it's a space scene. Then you'll zoom in on a planet and it's a different scene, and you just continue zooming in and there's dozens and dozens of different frames within small sections of the other ones.
There is that's a marvelous description of that. I haven't seen that example, but I have to tell you that in some realms of my own art, what I'm fascinated by is I'll take a picture of. I saw last week. I think I was disturbing somebody who was walking next to me. I was going into the hardware. I stopped in the parking lot. It's a very bumpy parking lot. I saw a figure in the tar. I whipped out my camera. I'm taking a picture, and a person comes up behind me and says, "What are you doing?" I said, "Taking a picture of the figure in the tar." The person stepped back and said, "Okay." Walked around the other side of the car. And I thought, okay, that probably wasn't the best presentation of me, but I don't care. I'm taking it. And then when you render that and you change the filter, and all the silicates in the tar become space itself. And you have a picture of a scene of the universe.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of thing, which means it's transcendental. The transcendentalist told us that the universe was within us. And what you just described, and I do want to see that, is it's the same thing. In each one of us, there's a universe.
Yeah.
Carlo Rovelli, who's a marvelous scientist and science writer, writing about space and time, essentially says in one of his books that we are all in our own time packet. Like all these particles bumping against each other, but we ultimately are in our own time. About a couple of weeks ago, there was a science article about entanglement, and it was about bombarding ions. I won't begin to try to explain them, but in bombarding ions for a few seconds, there was a result that was unexpected, which created a new kind of time in which those ions existed in two different times simultaneously.
Yeah.
How could, so the earlier question, do I know more than I did? Nope.
Yeah. No, and it's a perfect, I think that perfectly encapsulates things. I have, it happens with me all the time with people. Hear people say, "Oh, where did the time go?" or these sorts of things. I think to myself, man, it seems like I've been alive forever. It seems like my life has been so long, and I'm a young person.
Yep.
And so just that difference, right? We are in our own sort of time packets. What's your favorite epistemological topic?
Well, I of course want to hear your answer to this too. Epistemology as a reminder being how we come to know
right
things, right? My favorite epistemological topic is how we shape questions, which is an art unto itself, which takes much practice. Which isn't to say we absolutely should be questioning all the time. But we also realize that our questions can be reshaped as we hear our own questions.
Yeah. That nicely dovetails into mine, which is empiricism, right? So obviously, working on a doctoral degree, you're a scientist. Anybody who's working on a PhD, you're taking some course in mathematics in order to be able to gather data and interpret data and know that your data is representing what you want it to represent and informing conclusions. And that's science. That's the way science works. But within the realm of psychology specifically, psychology is a very young science. It's not very old. And things have developed very quickly in its 150, 200-year history. And we've reached a point in psychology that they're calling postmodernism, right?
Yes.
So modern, and most people who think of psychology or think of, sciences in general, think of modernism, which is empiricism, essentially, right? You start from a neutral viewpoint, and then you form theories and you test those theories and you come to certain points, certain knowledge. And so postmodernism is interesting because what they're saying in psychology, right, is that there is no neutral point from which to start. If you're studying the human mind with a human mind, naturally value laden and presuppositional things are playing into how you're doing your research, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, what does that mean, right? It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For some people, it means that psychology never worked in the first place and that we should discard empiricism and modernity and go back to doing things the way that we did them in ancient times.
So very well in ancient times.
Right. So very well in ancient times. And, other people are saying, well, I mean, if you look over the past 150, 200 years, it's a start and go thing, right? You look at Freud and you say, well, man, how much truth was there to what he was doing? How much value was there to what he was doing? How much science was there to what he was doing? And wrestling with this. So empiricism is the one that I find fascinating because I think that anybody who's intellectually and academically honest is going to say there's a middle ground, right? I don't think in good conscience, in psychology anyways, we can continue to say that we're starting from a neutral place. But at the same time, we also have to say that the process of science and the process of gaining empirical knowledge means something. And it has gained us something over the past 150 years.
It does.
And figuring out how osmotic that boundary is and where you draw the line and how much weight you give to empiricism versus the place that people start from is going to determine the future of the field and how we interpret knowledge in the future.
First, that's a wondrous encapsulation. Essentially, what you're talking about is meta-epistemology, which considers from a realist sometimes and from an arealist other times viewpoint to what degree things cannot be neutral. I remember saying many times in science writing classes that social sciences for a long time eschewed the use of the personal pronoun I, because it would give the impression of lacking neutrality. But there are many ways to write, as I was trying to point out to people, where you don't have to use that personal pronoun, but it's obviously still there. So it's not a revelation to say that there's not absolute neutrality in the sense of when somebody sees something, because we don't know our own implicit biases sometimes, which is not to say that we still can't render something relatively neutral.
Yeah.
So that takes something really simple. So I can say this is Saturday afternoon. That's not quite true. And so somebody would have to say, okay, no, actually it's Saturday morning. Well, it's Saturday morning where we sit now talking, but it's already Saturday evening someplace which will be hearing this. And so is that neutral? No, it's rendering that there are a number of facts that are equally true in that moment. But if I say within this time frame, it is Saturday morning, then I've presented a fact if I've identified the time frame. And so we have facts. There are, it's unassailable to me, no matter what the philosophical position is that attacks that there's no such thing as factuality. I think that's nonsense.
Yeah, and I think that you've done a good job with that illustration of demonstrating how to arrive at facts. The importance of epistemology, right, is within psychology, right? You can perform experiments and you can do things and you can control for variables in such a way that you can prove causal mechanisms. But I think that the trade-off there, right, is that the knowledge is going to be necessarily
provisional.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what people don't like, right? They want to have an encompassing theory, or they want to have something that applies in such a way. But there's other ways of doing that, right? You can say that a person acts this way in this situation, and that's psychology. But if they act this way in this situation, that might be a sociological thing, or a biological thing, or a physiological, or whatever the case may be. So looking at things from these different perspectives, you can gain a deeper understanding. But the frustration at saying, well, this field is too shallow, right? We're not really learning deep things about the human mind.
I politely say bunk.
Yeah, exactly.
Also, the very nature of the thing that sometimes holds us back so much is our love affair with the rigidity or the staticness of categories.
Right. Yeah.
We just get all incensed, we human beings who are still in the caves, about crossing boundaries. No.
Yeah.
There are always borders. There are always boundaries, and you can't. Well, yeah, something can be psychological, sociological, anthropological, philosophical.
Yeah.
All at the same time.
Right.
Oh, is that messy? You bet.
How about ontology? What's your favorite topic?
Well, this is just not going to be inspirational at all. My favorite topic is what it means to be. That's the ontology itself. My favorite topic is the basis of ontology, which is when I say I am a human being, I'm referring to the organic, perhaps, but also the intangibles. But to be is what? To live? Is it to just sit and breathe? Yeah.
Yeah. Who was it? There was a philosopher, Parthenides. He was a foil of Heraclitus, and that's what he said. It was, what is it to be?
Yes.
Right. Because Heraclitus was about becoming things.
Parmenides.
Yes, Parmenides. Yeah. So Heraclitus, everything is in change. Everything is in flux. But he was the opposite way, right? It was, what is it to be? What is static, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that is that is the foundational of ontology, like you said. And that's sort of the wellspring of philosophy, right? Is that we have this integrated subjective experience of reality, but then we have tools that contradict those realities, right? That tell us that there's things far beyond what our senses can give us. This a priori versus priori knowledge, which we did an episode on, and trying to synergize. Okay, well, what does that all mean for me, right? What does it mean now that I know what the beginning of the universe looks like, or now that I know that there's all of this light spectrum that I can't see, or now that I know that a male spider will willingly let himself be eaten after he copulates. What does that mean for what it means to be, right? Mm-hmm. And it just raises those questions.
It does, doesn't it? It raises because people will choose. I've had students who do this. I understand. My head is hurting. I don't want to think about that. Okay. But maybe you will anyway at some point, or you'll run away from it shrieking. Nope. Has nothing to do with me. People get to choose that. We are choosing beings. I've just thought of two poles in literature, though, that when you were just describing one, we've got Ahab, who has a personal vendetta against that white whale because it munched his leg, sort of like Captain Hook and the Croc, except much more serious, or in his arm. Or we have Bartleby the Scrivener, who sits in one place and doesn't do anything. Whenever anybody asks him to do something, I prefer not to. We have Ahab, who's conceived the entire universe as being located. The locus of that is that amorphous evil in that white whale. And he's going after it with all his being. He doesn't care who he sacrifices to get there. And we have Bartleby, who's absolutely static. And if you read those tales, and you just read them because somebody assigned them, and he's like, okay, I'm done with that. Give me the quiz and I'm done. Well, they probably didn't get much from it, but if you read the tales and say, what is going on here? There's a lot of psychology going on in both of those characters, and they're determining their life paths very differently. For me, the ontological question of being, the great liberation of it is to be free of the sticking tar of advertisements and so much else telling you what you are supposed to want, or people saying this isn't the right way to be in a country, this is the right way to be in a country, whatever it happens to be. And so if I choose to spend an afternoon drawing, and someone else chooses to say, well, you're just wasting your time, inside I don't care.
Right.
I'm taking a picture of a being in tar, and someone else finds that insane. Goody for them. How I am feeling on the interior, which is alive, a fire and a light, by doing art, is that any less important than looking at the stars? Is that any less important than pressing a button X number of times in order to produce an item? No. Is it any more important than those either? Not necessarily, because it depends on the time and space in which one is existing.
Yeah. And that's my favorite ontological topic, is consciousness, right? Which is just looking at that in a different flavor, right? Seeing Ahab or Bartleby. And then from my subjective experience, trying to imagine what their subjective experience is, right?
Yeah.
Like what, if the same thing happened to me, would I react the same way? No. So what happened in the course of their life events? What is their reality that led them to take these drastic actions or non-drastic actions and live this way? And I think that, again, this is not something that's unique to me. I think that you don't have to look any farther than the cultural obsession with serial killer documentaries, right?
Yes, yeah.
People are obsessed with these things because they can't, for the life of them, understand. They can't put themselves in these people's shoes, but they desperately want to. They want to understand what was the experience of this person that led them to do these terrible things.
Some want to understand it, and some simply want, going back to an earlier metaphor, the lurid nature of, a terrible monster story, but don't let them get me.
Yeah.
The lurid. That's been part of pulp fiction and reality magazines long before they were called that. Crime stories,
Yeah.
So somehow, I don't know. It fascinates people.
Yeah. And so, and listeners, I'm sure understand that part of my fascination of consciousness extends into the animal kingdom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we know, based off of animal actions, right, that they're conscious. They understand space, and to a lesser extent, probably time and cause and effect and these other things. And, if anybody's had a pet, affection, punishment, all of these concepts that we could spend an hour talking about. These are complex thoughts and emotions and things. But it's not the same as what we experience. And so trying to put yourself in that place, it's impossible, right? Because I think part of what separates us from the animals is the meta part, right? The metaphilosophy, the ability to step back and think about thinking. Animals don't seem to possess that.
There's the word, don't seem to.
Right.
Because we still like to say that we have the meta because we have ways of expressing it that we understand.
Right.
Well, there's a whole lot of built-in stuff there that's
yeah.
And I'm not just saying, well, yeah, all animals have the same consciousness. No, of course they don't necessarily have the same consciousness, but that doesn't preclude the possibility of consciousness that is every bit as complex as ours, except we don't know how to measure it yet.
Yeah, and this pops up all the time, right? They find out that dragonflies can predict their body in space in the future, right? And they say, there's no way that based off their brain volume, they should be able to do that. Or the most recent one was they just found jumping spiders have REM sleep. They said, "Whoa, we did not think that these things were able to have dreams."
Yeah, what dreams may come for a spider? I mean, and I think that's what makes people more and more uncomfortable. We talked, I think, briefly about an AI algorithmic development that is happening for a translator. That eventually, it seems, would be able to render something of what animals are thinking. We may not want to know what animals are thinking. What would people think if they listened and the cow was saying, "No, no, don't kill me now"?
Right.
On the other hand, the cow may be thinking, light, dark, light again, hungry. We don't, but the possibility.
Yeah.
We project ourselves. Look at there's this article I read this week about this device called Moxie, which this is a big thing to me, is on Mars now. It was part of a rover package. Right? And it is generating in all of the temperature ranges and conditions that it's been placed in, generating oxygen from CO2. So in essence, and they're envisioning putting a bigger package in. Well, we're not talking about terraforming Mars in a few years and suddenly having an atmosphere. We're talking about multiple generations we couldn't possibly imagine if we did that. But the point is, we have put a box on another planet that is altering the planet before we're even there. We have projected ourselves into that place before we even solve anything here. And you do not have to have the dichotomy or the binary opposition of space exploration or fixing the planet. They both are much more connected than that, I think.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, the hubris, the arrogance, the brilliance, all of it of being able to put a box way out there to do that. How dare we start working on another planet and yet we've done it. So the dragonfly projecting itself into the future, we're the dragonfly.
Yeah. Yeah. So what is your favorite aesthetic topic?
I should have anticipated these last year. My favorite aesthetic topic is why we sometimes seem to think that we have to localize and tame the notion of beauty.
Yeah. Yeah. Aesthetics is fascinating because of, like we were just talking about, consciousness, sort of the subjective nature of the qualifications, right? Who is to say what is beautiful?
Yeah.
Beauty necessarily, because of the different subjective experiences, is going to vary from person to person.
And
so
from culture to culture and from time to time.
Yeah. So how do we, and so then, there's probably people who are saying, okay, well then it's all relativistic, right? But my favorite aesthetic topic is architecture. And I think architecture summarizes this pretty well, right? We might not all agree on our favorite type of architecture, right? Not everybody thinks Baroque architecture or, Art Deco or whatever is nice. But can we all agree that having a 7-foot ceiling with fluorescent lights in a rectangular building is not aesthetically pleasing? I think almost everybody would. That would almost be a universal thing. So it seems that aesthetic and beauty judgments might have truths, but then what springs from that, what people consider beauty, it goes beyond it.
And then you're back to asking the meta aesthetics question, which is, what is the structure of our suppositions about beauty, which essentially boils down to, and I love your architectural because it's so immediate. if we can say something, what makes something not beautiful, that means we have the capacity to keep working at articulating what is, whether it's true for everybody or just true for a small number. It's likely that more than one person is going to consider a building beautiful or not. It's also quite likely that somebody's going to walk by a building and say, that's not art, just like they walk by a statue somebody has worked on, a sculpture that somebody's worked on for hours, days, weeks, months longer, and say, that's crap, that's trash. Oh, well, then your responsibility, if you're engaging, is to say why, which is to start asking questions. Why would I call it trash? What is it about it that I find offensive?
Yeah.
What doesn't make it art in my view? Because then what is art?
Yeah, this is the hard work of aesthetics, right? That people don't want to do, is separating or not conflating aesthetics with other ideas, whether it's efficiency or complexity or whatever. Because let's take our rectangular 7-foot ceiling, fluorescently lit building. If you were to put that in the Stone Age, I'm sure that a caveman would quickly clamber into it. He would forsake the Milky Way and the crickets and everything else in nature to have that shelter. But not necessarily because he considers it more beautiful than nature, but because it offers him an advantage that he doesn't have. It offers him a shelter that he doesn't have. I think that's the issue with aesthetics, right? Is people want to look at art and say, oh, well, putting together a bunch of trash didn't cost any money, or, it doesn't realistically represent something, or it was done quickly, or whatever it may be. These are all conflating concepts. They do not address what is beauty and how do we make beauty judgments.
Wonderfully said. My brother, bless him, he's an amazing photographer. He's an artist. He's a truck driver. He works for the DOT. And he has a phrase that he likes to use, which I always giggle at, which is, we pick things up, we put things down. But that's what we all do. That is what the human species does. Opening it up more, we dig things out, we put them back, whatever. But yes, if that cave person is going into that and saying, oh, protection, safety, warmth, whatever, I still say that before long, that caveman's going to get some clay or a piece of coal out of the fire and draw pictures on the wall. Because that's what we do with blank spaces. We fill them in with our own narratives, our own conceptions. And for somebody who says, oh, well, that sculpture is not, that's just ugly, that's awful. Well, my mind is always, what's hanging on your wall? Is it all representational? That's okay if that's what you find beautiful. Is here's a picture of a barn. Here's a picture of my family. Here's a picture of a flower. But I know what it is. Well, that means that you're limiting the idea of beauty to just the representational. You certainly have the right to do that. But I require of you that if you want to engage me with insulting a piece of art, you talk to me about why you think it isn't. And I can't force people to do that, but that's what we do as philosophers.
Yeah.
Is to poke and to probe.
Right, exactly. So do you have a favorite philosopher?
I did. I do. I guess it's probably terribly disappointing in the sense of it locates me in my time and space. Socrates is rendered by Plato, or Socrates, as I've learned, is actually the pronunciation, and not because he's a self-described ugly old bald guy, but because as rendered, which is due acknowledgement to his student who tried to hit Socrates didn't write anything. Right. Who knows?
Yeah.
Aesop, right?
Yeah,
Socrates, Homer. As rendered by his student Plato, Socrates is the model for me of how we go through life. Now, Are there feminist and strong women and trans philosophers who do the same thing? Absolutely. So I'm not locating Socrates by saying, well, there's the old white guy that I live by. No, it's the way of approaching.
Yeah.
That filters all the way into most of the other philosophers that I've enjoyed and still enjoy.
No, I think that Socratic questioning changed the face of Western thought, really. And I mean, I know it changed the how I think about things, right? And it changes the way that I engage with people who have different viewpoints of mine.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, like you said, there's good, bad, and ugly about Socrates, but I think that on that fact alone, just the idea of Socratic questioning and how Plato documented it and rendered it, it's one of the seminal points in philosophy, right? And even the things, that the Socrates might have been wrong about, I'm sure that if you put a Socratic line of questioning to him, he might change his mind.
He might change his mind. And that's why I say it I think I'm crawling out from underneath the question by saying Socrates, but every other philosopher was questioned before and since.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I can do it. I don't think I have a favorite. I know that the ones I tend to be drawn towards are also some of the early philosophers. For me, it's a fascination with the generalist because that's who I identify with, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a generalist. Like I do a bunch of different things. And thinking about these guys that did it so much better than me, your Da Vinci or your Pythagoras or these guys that knew everything there was to know, right? Which of course is an epistemological thing in itself. But really, you look at the accomplishments of these guys, and not just in science or philosophy or thought, but in art, in mathematics, in a variety of different fields. Those are the ones that tend to appeal to me, are these guys where you just go, man, you were living the life. And of course they weren't. You had to drink hemlock or you got exiled to another country or these other things. But
right.
But you look at the life story, you look at the progression,
yeah,
the personal growth, the personal contributions to our modern thought, our modern science and things. And you're just in awe. It's like, how did one person do all of this?
And even if they did, then I'm at in the place, because if I weren't, I wouldn't have been paying attention. We are taught about these guys because that's what it was about for so long, and it's still in some curricula. That's still what it's about, which is to say, all of the women, all of the people across time who have been trans or multigendered or agendered or all the terminology we have, who existed then just exist now. We're beginning to make an effort to find out what they contributed. And of course, they contributed much. And all the matriarchal cultures where shamanistic practice led to non-Western wisdom. That we do or don't even know about yet. So we start from what we have been taught. We start from what we've experienced and what we know, and at the same time can say, and some people might say this is being politically correct of me, but I don't think so. Not.
Yeah, I think any diligent student of history is, and we did a whole episode on historicity, which studies this, is going to look at it and say there wasn't a lack of capability, a lack of ability, or even a lack of output. What there was a lack of was a power dynamic that allowed this progress to be carried on and brought to us today.
I think it's important to acknowledge that, because it's to say, I'm still learning. I'm still finding out. I'm reading female philosophers. I'm reading philosophers who are neither male nor female or both. And that is exciting. But I think that the eminent signpost or anchor point or buoy in the ocean is the model that has been presented to us as Socrates or Socrates. that we know was done somewhere before and after, because humans are what they are.
Yeah.
Somebody didn't invent questioning.
Right. And I think this has exciting implications for the future if we can continue to be progressive in our receptivity to diverse viewpoints. I had an interaction with a student on a discussion board this week, and her course of study is she wants to study female pornography consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And she said there is no research about it. It's all about men. And, the reason for that is probably because a lot of the academics who are looking at this are men. And so their natural interest is in male reactions to it. But there's been studies, one of which you referenced, that said up to 60% of pornography consumers are female. So it's not that it's not happening. It's not that, things aren't going on, but it's just that there's a lack of diversity in the researchers who are looking at the topics.
Yeah.
And as we get more women and more trans people and more, people from different racial and ethnic and cultural backgrounds into the higher echelons of academia, you expect research interests and thus knowledge in all the various fields to diversify and become much more encompassing.
Yeah, the LGBTQ plus, the constructiveness of knowledge added to and blooming past what we already have. That's exciting to me. That's to me but that's like also looking at the galaxy. I can see a real-time image of, real-time, a web telescope image of a galaxy that is mirrored through another galaxy. There was an image.
Yeah, an Einstein ring. Right? Yeah.
An Einstein ring. And know that that's long gone, probably.
Yeah.
And yet see that. And somehow I look at myself as, for a moment, being that Einstein ring. I'm going to be long gone, and whatever humanity has become, it's going to become, because I'm only one particle in humanity. But the fact that I can see humanity project the dragonfly, right?
Right.
That we, even as you've mentioned, when the sun expands and burns the planet to a crisp, maybe we have moved on. If we've moved on by that point, millions of years from now, we won't even know what we would look like. We won't even know what we would sound like. We can't imagine a billion years of evolution.
Yeah. Or maybe the sun expands the earth, we all get burnt to a crisp, but then it creates a habitable environment on the moon Enceladus around Jupiter, and a new sentient species evolves and has a philosophy of its own. Right?
Fascinating.
The metaview. Right?
The metaverse.
It's big looking at things. So do you have a favorite philosophy book?
I do. There are two, and you've mentioned. There's a marvelous British writer named A.C. Grayling, whose books, plural, just reinvigorated me about philosophy. One I used for many semesters with students and drew upon and have asked them to read and for us to discuss was Ideas That Matter. Because for me, it was the first concerted effort by a philosopher of great means and academic prowess to render philosophy in bite size, as we say, essays of a page or two. So here's an idea philosophically that has mattered across parts of time to humanity. Thus, it's like having a campfire ready for a match. You've set it up. You've got this wonderful fire built, or the setting is there. Put the match under it. And I think that his book, that particular one, also Rollo May, who wrote a number of things, but the Courage to Create, which is a philosophy of psychology and aesthetics that I still find I learn from.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, that's one of the ones that you had me read in the introductory philosophy class that really it blew my mind. I think that the one that I enjoy the most is The Origins of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, done by Julian Jaynes. And the book has been sort of disparaged, but largely because Jaynes represented it as a scientific text. And so as a result, scientists and academics pointed out, rightly so, that there's no way of falsifying the theory. There's no way of presenting evidence for it, that sort of thing. So it's not science. But just because something is science doesn't mean that it's not an excellent work of philosophy,
right,
which is what it is. And Jaynes himself, again, credentials, we don't dwell on him, but he was of the highest order in looking at schooling
and his own learning accomplishments.
Yeah. And just, like I said, my favorite ontological topic is consciousness. And his sort of theoretical history of the development of human consciousness is so well done that it will keep you up at night thinking, wow, even if this isn't how it happened, it raises the question in your mind. At some point, the human species may not have been conscious, at least not in a human way, perhaps in an animal way, but now we're conscious in a human way. When did that switch flip, and what did it look like? And his illustration of that is just captivating, and I always love that book. I always recommend it to people. All right. We've gone very long, and I hope all the listeners have stuck with us, but I'll ask one final question. I don't normally do this, and I probably should, but do you have any final thoughts? Anything that you want to put on the end that we haven't already talked about?
There is no final thought. There's only a provisional moment when we take a breather. No.
I think that's a great way to end. Because like we talked about, like I said in the intro, right? We're not done. And we could never be done, right? Someday the show will end, right? Someday just like the way the earth will end, right? But even when it ends, we're not going to stop doing philosophy, right? It can't be done. It's always going to be something that continues on. And each week we'll continue molding the clay, and reshaping it and redoing things.
Yeah.
And so, no, right? A final word indicates that there's nothing more to say about a topic, and that's just not us, right?
No, it's not.
All right. Until next time, keep